Good. Ready? Okay, we're good. Okay, Isaac and I did some research and are presenting a project on the German U-boat U-1206, which was a submarine during World War II. I don't want to give away too much on what exactly happened right now, but we'll get into it. So we're going to start off with a brief history of submarine. Oh, wrong slide. Thank you. A brief history of submarines, not the sandwich kind, but it is a beautiful sandwich. So the earliest concept of submarines or submersibles goes back really far into history. The most basic concept is just like a hollowed out stick where you can breathe underwater through the stick. But this here is a painting of Alexander the Great. I disconnect. This is a painting of Alexander the Great using basically a cage, a glass cage that would be submerged underwater and then towed by ropes or chains so that they could sneakily sneak behind enemy lines. And this is actually the first documented submersible vessel, I suppose, opposed to just like using a stick. Fast forwarding, this is the incendiary diver, which was was the first submarine built in Germany in 1850, designed by Wilhelm Bauer. At the time, the common tactic to break through a naval blockade was to use what's called an incendiary ship, where they would just load a ship with explosives, set it on fire, and let it drift into the blockade, and it would just blow up. The problem is it costs one ship every time you do that. So the idea behind the incendiary diver was it could dive underwater, sail up to the blockade, place a mine, sail away, and then the blockade would be destroyed without blowing up your own ship. And it's also, little fun fact, the oldest surviving submarine in the world at some museum. I don't know which one. Well, it exploded the enemies, just not itself. It could dive underwater, place the mine, and then sail away without being seen, then be safe while the explosion goes off. Whereas in a regular incendiary ship, you just let it drift. Yes, it was reusable. These are the, I don't want to say blueprints, but designs for the ship. White prints. Um, like do a little pointing action. And the top picture is a top-down view. So there's two wheels, one above and one below. Those would be turned by two men. It was manually powered. So they would use their hands and feet to turn those cogs, which would turn the propeller. And there would be a third person at the front who would control the steering and also place the mines. Next slide. Fast forwarding again, during World War I, that's kind of the first time that U-boats were extensively used in a war effort. The most infamous incident, I suppose, from World War I would be the RMS Lusitania, which was a passenger ship that sailed between North America and the UK. And during one of its voyages, it was targeted and destroyed by a U-boat off the coast of, I think it was Scotland or Italy. It was either Scotland or Italy. I don't know geography too well. But in any case, it was sank and it became a large propaganda machine, I suppose, which helped in forcing America to support the war effort. Unfortunately, out of the 2,000 people on board, 1,200 passed away from the sinking of this ship. And then in between at the end of World War I, Germany had the blame placed on them for most of the war. And because of that and the treaty, they were limited in their naval power significantly. They could only have 1/3 of the ships that England had. Despite that agreement, Germany just kind of did whatever they wanted, and they had the largest submarine fleet going into World War II, which Similar to the Lusitania incident, there was the SS Athenia, which was another passenger ship that sailed between the Americas and the UK. And again, a U-boat targeted the ship and sank it. Despite strict orders to not attack a passenger ship, the Germans were trying to avoid another propaganda incident, but mistakes were made and the ship was sank. Out of the 1,500 on board, 120 were killed. So thankfully, not as many deaths, but not a good incident regardless. Changing topics to, I don't want to just read off the slide, the U-boat mission, just kind of their general objective and goals throughout World War II, their kind of purpose of being used. Their main objective and target throughout the war, both wars actually, were merchant ships. They were trying to enforce a blockade where they were preventing the Allied nations from sending supplies over to Europe. Throughout the war, they sank 3,000 ships total, and 2,800 of them were merchant ships. So almost exclusively, they attacked merchant ships. As far as the construction of the ships, this picture is kind of a good image. There's a main section in the front. They would build, I don't remember if it was 7 or 9 sections total, and then they would weld them all together. But throughout World War II, they deployed 850 U-boats. And sadly, I suppose, 800 of them were sank during the war. Almost all of them did not make it back home. As far as the crewmen, most of them didn't make it back home either. So out of the 39,000 crewmen and sailors throughout World War II, 75% were casualties and 70% passed away. So that's 27,000 sailors passed away while on board a U-boat. And their average age was just 20 years old. So there was a large percentage of young men that passed away just from being on these U-boats. As far as their life on the ship, was not very good. Pretty bad. As far as hygiene, there was basically none. On the German U-boats, there were no showers. Temperatures were super hot most of the time. They had no uniforms to change into. So after a month at sea, they would just turn their uniforms inside out and then just put them back on. So whatever grease and grossness was on the outside was just now on the insides. The ships didn't have a ventilation system. So all the diesel fumes just got trapped inside the ships and everything smelled and tasted like diesel. And like the food just tasted like diesel. They smoked on board, so there was cigarette smoke in the air. And probably worst of all, their toilet systems didn't work while diving underwater. At least the majority of ships didn't have functioning toilets. They worked normally on the surface, but once they dove underwater, due to the water pressure, the toilets couldn't flush. So they used open buckets to use the restroom while they were under the water. And that was just super gross. In fact, the stench and just bad air within the ships would get so bad when they came back to the docks to refuel or do repairs or whatever. The dock crew would frequently vomit just from the smell of the ship just airing out. It was just really bad. You could argue that the American crews had a little bit of luxury in that they did have showers. So it was slightly less gross. They also joined the war effort later, so that was probably part of the reason. So I was inspired by the stories of the gross hygiene to create my personal. Well, that is a good point. But I've created what my personal interpretation of a war recruitment postcard would be like from the time period. This is what I believe the Germans would send out to resident homes to get them to join the war effort. So it reads as, Dear loyal citizen, come enjoy scenic views of saltwater on our luxurious Type 7 U-boats. Our top-notch wartime facilities include, but are not limited to, lack of showers, overwhelming cigarette smoke, the stench of body odor, no functioning toilets at depth, vomit-inducing smells, and most importantly, you. We await for your swiftest of replies. Do it or else, the Third Reich. And P.S. The Gestapo will be watching you. Should have mentioned this earlier. We did contact a few museums to get these pictures. It's really hard to find pictures of these U-boats from World War II. So thankfully, we were able to get some high quality pictures. So this here is a picture of a forward torpedo room on a U-boat, a German U-boat. On the sides, you can see where their bunks were. Find it kind of amusing that someone had to climb over an active torpedo to go to bed every night. But these beds would very quickly fill with grease and sweat because one, they couldn't shower, and also the crew there weren't enough bunks for each crewman to have their own, so they had to share these bunks, which just amplified how quickly they became dirty. This is a set of bunks on the USS Cod. So this is an American submarine. They have some thicker mattresses compared to the German one, and they also have some bags for some storage, which is kind of interesting. And they could also fold up. On the left, you can see where they've folded up some of the bunks that aren't currently in use. They got some extra space out of that. This is the bunk for the captain. A little bit nicer, I suppose. Has some personal space and storage available to him. And these are more bunks on the USS Cod, and they just took the torpedoes near the beds to the extreme because they just sandwiched them between the bunks. I don't know why they did it that way. This is the galley or kitchen on board a U-boat. Again, everything would taste like diesel, and it was very tiny. You would have to like kind of step out to turn around. You couldn't like really do a 360 in place because it was so tiny. I also find it interesting. The cook would have to keep track of one, how much food was on board, but also where it was located on the ship so that the diving officer could keep the ship in balance while submerged. The placement of the food affected how they balanced the ship. This is the galley on the USS Cod, and they got some props, much bigger than the German one. And there is a picture of a guy reenacting what it would be like to work in the kitchen. This would be the mess area on the USS. They're basically just like park benches, wooden benches, and they have a track on the bottom where they could slide out of the way. This is the officer mess area. They kind of have a classic restaurant booth style seating. This is the engine room in a German U-boat. On the left and on the right, there's two separate engines. So they had duplicate engines, I suppose would be the way to say it. In the winter, there wasn't really like insulation or temperature control on board these ships. So in the winter, when the waters were cold, the ship would be freezing. So the crew would huddle inside this tiny engine room hallway to stay warm. And then in the summer months, the ship would be well over 100 degrees. So they'd get nice and sweaty, not take showers, not change their clothes, and then go into a used bed. This is another diesel engine on a U-boat. I think this is a later model. And this is the electric motor room where they controlled the electric motor. I should take a step back. While surfaced, the U-boats would run on the diesel engines. The diesel engines would propel them on the surface and then also charge the batteries. When submerged, they couldn't use the diesel engines because they didn't have a ventilation system. They would have to use their battery power to run their electric engines. So this electric room is where they would control those electric batteries. Charge time was typically around 7 hours from empty. So while they're surfaced, they'd have to run their diesel engine to charge the battery from empty to full. It'd take about 7 hours, kind of depends. And also, they usually wouldn't run it completely empty. And they could stay underwater for about 12 hours if they really wanted to push their motors. This is a U-boat. I don't really know how to describe this without contrasting. The shape of the ship has a very pointed ship shape opposed to a rounded shape that you see on modern submarines. And that's due to the ships spending most of their time on the surface. They were really limited on how long they could be underwater, so they tried to stay on the surface as much as possible. This hull shape, if you will, would provide a more stable ship while on the surface, but of course, underwater, it would rock much more. And just to give the contrast, this is a modern submarine with a much rounder shape to it. Modern submarines can stay submerged for months. Their real limiting factor is honestly the food more so than their motors. They have ventilation to get oxygen. They can stay under as long as they have food supplies. So they have a ship shape that is more suited to staying submerged. This would be a toilet on board a U-boat. I kind of already mentioned that the toilets wouldn't work at depth, at least the early ones. But much later into the war effort, the Germans did eventually develop a water pressurized system where the toilets could be flushed at depth. Sadly, well, I don't know about sadly, but the system to use the water pressurized toilets would be kind of retrofitted onto this toilet, and it made the system much more complicated. And then just to kind of finish off the tour, I don't have too much to say about these slides, but this is a control room on the USS Cod. So this is a American submarine. Note the red lights. The submarines and U-boats would use white lights while surfaced during the day. And then at night, they would switch over to these red lights. One, to help with circadian rhythm, just so your body gets that day-night cycle. And also the red lights kind of help them develop like night vision almost, where if they had to use the periscope to see outside while it's dark, their eyes would be able to adjust to that more easily. This is the motor control room. So this is where you would adjust the propulsion of the ship. That's separate from the actual engines and motors. This is a control room on a U-boat. Does that look like a fun place to work at? This is the steering wheel on a U-boat. And then this is called the compass card. It's just a bunch of dials showing depth and battery charge and fuel, those types of things. They're in German, so I don't know what each one does individually. This is a torpedo room. Could load and fire 4 torpedoes. I don't know if they could fire them all at once, but they could load 4 at once. And then this is the conning tower. We go back a few slides. Yeah. So that kind of top part that sticks out, that's called the conning tower. It's basically just like a separated room. And that's where they keep the periscopes. So if you go forward again. This is inside that conning tower, and that pole in the center is a periscope. And then since the ships had to spend a lot of time on the surface, they would be fitted with deck guns, which modern submarines don't use or need because they just stay underwater. Some of the countermeasures that they had to face, a really common one was just explosives. These are called depth charges. They're basically just barrels of explosives that would be dropped on into the water and they'd explode at a set depth. So they would try to guess what depth the U-boat was at, and they would drop a bomb that would hopefully be close enough to damage the ship. Those eventually evolved into uh, those evolved into hedgehogs. These are like, depends on what model, 25 to 30 individual explosives that would all be fired, and they would kind of scatter at different depths. So the U-boat couldn't just dive to a different depth to escape these. They would have to move to a different area to hopefully get away from whoever was firing explosives at them. This here is a U-boat that was actually hit by a depth charge. So that big dent and all those holes came from a single explosive. And that, of course, would be enough to render the ship useless. Another countermeasure, threat that the U-boats faced was planes, especially near the coastline. The Allies would send out scout planes to just kind of patrol the area. And since the U-boats weren't fully equipped to fight off planes, their really only defense would be to dive underwater. And the Allies' main tactic with using these planes was to constantly force the U-boats to dive under the surface over and over, which would starve out their batteries because they wouldn't be able to stay on the surface, run their diesel engines, recharge their batteries. And eventually the batteries would be dead. The U-boat would be forced to stay on the surface, and then the Allies would be able to take out the boat, I guess. I am now going to pass off to Isaac.
Thank you, Ryan. It'll make it easier. All right, so now we can get to the story of U-1206. This is the ship's emblem, and which will now forever go down in infamy. So, on April 14th, 1945, U-1206 was cruising at a depth of 200 feet off the coast of Scotland. So we were one day away from the anniversary, which could have made this the perfect presentation. Now we can't. So anyway, on that day, our beloved Commander Schlitt had to use the restroom. Now, U-1206 was retrofitted recently with new pressurized toilets that can be used at depth. So these valves are not used for firing torpedoes. They are used to flush this toilet. And a specialist was required because all these had to be flipped or turned in a specific order to operate the toilet. So the commander didn't contact the specialist when using the toilet. Here is an image of what this toilet is probably not pressurized, and this is probably the closest we can get to what the toilet actually looked like. So the specialist came here and misjudged the issue, which may have caused an issue like this, or like this, or like this. Okay, maybe not like this. More realistically, it was probably something like the worst bidet ever. Now, normally it wasn't actually enough water to like change the pressure of the boat. It wasn't like an emergency. So nothing like that happened, but there was a bigger problem. You see, the batteries of the ship were placed directly under the location of the toilet, which means salt water leaked from the toilet onto the batteries. Now, here's what one of the batteries similarly looked like. This is a later model produced by Battery Works in Germany. Now, they looked a bit different, but it gets the point across. So, if you didn't know, when salt water touches lead acid batteries, it produces chlorine gas. So if you recall, these submarines had terrible to no ventilation, which means chlorine gas begins filling up the ship and they had to immediately surface. And unfortunately, they surfaced right underneath an enemy patrol craft, which means they had no choice but to scuttle the boat and go out to sea, where, due to the rough Scottish seas, two and a half, I'm sure if it's two or three people died, and the remaining 46 members were captured. So, what can we, wait, oh yes, how can we solve the problems of U-1206? Well, the modern solutions include much simpler toilets. So as you can see, there's only just a handle and a valve. And side note, the floors are sealed. Major improvements here. But not actually, it might depend on the submarine, but I would hope not. So anyway, the instructions actually are posted on the wall just in case you forget. So and here the instructions seem complicated, but it's actually quite simple. Do your business, open the lever, turn the valve, close the lever, close the valve. Very simple. Makes it quick. So some other modern improvements include showers, which is quite lovely. Surprisingly, hot bunking is still a thing, but the beds aren't terribly greasy because, well, you have showers. So other improvements. Hot bunking, as they would, well,
It was a colloquial term for using still warm from the previous and they still do.
and then other improvements include better ventilation and food that no longer tastes like diesel. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Questions, comments, concerns, toilet-related humor? Okay, yeah, yeah, we should have brought a model. Um, no, it's just, yeah, yes, 'cause I mean, yeah, it was, yeah, end of the war. They just started using high pressure toilets, so that led to, no, I couldn't say that. I could say, I mean, he allegedly the toilet. He denies it, but of course he would. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, no, the specialist says it with him. So I'd lean more with the specialist, considering he also admitted that he didn't fix the problem. So I'll lean with the more honest specialist. Yeah, considering that they placed the batteries underneath the toilet. So, I mean, I feel like I don't know if the Germans knew it was the end of the war, but I feel like it was a bit late in the war to switch from non-functional toilets to functional toilets. Yeah. So,
I think depth charges have like a 5%.
I think they increased.
5% chance of actually, but the hedgehogs have like a 70% chance. Under the surface, they have really bad maneuverability because they had that a more tip shaped hull that was more designed. So on the surface, they were a little more maneuverable, but not as they weren't as maneuverable as a regular. Yeah, they didn't really have enough equipment to fight while on the surface, while other ships have things. Hardly weren't really that good. Well, a lot of them, that for sure. A lot of them, a lot them being the merchant ships were just affected early on, but then kind of yeah. Yeah, that's well said. And I know I don't know the exact quote, but Winston Churchill has a quote where it says, like the one thing the element of surprise really affected a lot. Okay. Yeah. Once there were convoys and escorts used by the Allies, the U-boats stopped fronting alone. They started sailing in. Ooh, and a good point on that. There was one U-boat, I can't think of the one in Chicago. That's the one they captured with had a working machine on it. Remember the number? I'm sorry. I do. I don't know. I didn't prepare how I was going to explain it. I have a five. U559 that they can. It's to like recapture it really sneakily, which makes sense. No, the Allies were trying to get it without letting the Germans know they got it. Oh, I see. Which makes sense. We're
very new.
Yeah, we've gone from silly to serious. Oh, well, they were fast. I don't think they were ever good. We could camouflage though. Yeah, it's not a bad idea. Yeah. Not doing anything. Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So, real quick, just thank you to everyone here who came. And then I did want to just a shout out to Nathaniel Witzel also. He also was an intricate part of gathering this information. He did a lot of work, so I want to make sure I also point a little bit of praise to him also for helping with all this. So, yeah, and we were talking about the East Palestine train wreck. So just some quick stats. This is actually news to me as well. On average, there's 3 train derails a day, which is way more than I thought. And then last year alone was over 1,100 train derailments. The largest cause of derailment is defective rails, which, I mean, you kind of imagine would cause it to jump the tracks if the rails weren't lined up. So this is just a brief timeline real quick. So on February 1st, the train left Madison, Illinois. Supposedly, the employees at the time were complaining that it was too long and it was overweight. And the train supposedly broke down also on the way, reportedly, I should say. And then 2 days later, there was security footage that recorded one of, it looked like the ball bearings on fire. There'll be more on that later. And then 20 minutes after that, the train drove past a wayside defect detector. We'll also talk more about what those are. At that time, the emergency brakes were engaged by the conductor. The train derailed and crashed, which we all know has the East Palestine train wreck. And then also 2 days after the train wreck was mandatory evacuation for everyone within 1 mile. And then the very next day was 2 miles. So anyone within 2 miles of the train wreck was evacuated. And on that same day, they then did a controlled, kind of a loaded statement, but as controlled as could be, burn on it, which of course led us to these infamous pictures, which I'm sure everyone in some way or another is familiar with. So now I was going to talk about possible causes. At this time, the leading theory is a overheated ball bearing. And what is a ball bearing? A ball bearing is something that, you can kind of see the diagram. If you hold the center still, the outside can still spin, and then if you hold the outside, the center can still spin. And it's controlled by this cage, which holds these balls in there, and you can see it allows it to roll freely. A lot of times there's a shaft that goes through these, and on the other side is then normally a wheel. I actually brought some things in. So these are ball bearings. I did clean these off best I could, so if people want to just take a look at them, that's one with the casing, that's one without the casing, and then this is one fully broke down. How does a ball bearing overheat? There's a lot of different ways. We're going to look at 4 different ways. One is lack of bearing lubrication, which will cause too much metal-to-metal contact. So the continual movement of the ball bearing, when there's not enough lubrication, that metal repeatedly rolling over will eventually start to burn up, and then that will cause it to overheat. The other way is bearing contamination. There's craters that can form when the ball bearing completely rolls over foreign objects, which is the contamination, which I'm talking about. And over time, those craters can cause vibration, and that vibration can cause overheating. And then the last one, and then overloading a bearing also can do it. What can happen if you overload a bearing is it will cause it to wear down on one side. And when that happens, you can get vibrations again, which will cause it to overheat. And then oxidation will also do that. So oxidation is just a fancy way of saying decomposing. When it starts to decompose, it can, that repetitive rolling over the decomposed location or where the oxidation is can cause overheating. When a bearing overheats, it can seize the bearing entirely, which will cause large amounts of stress on the wheel. As a result, the entire wheel can seize, and in the case of the train, it can generate enough heat to actually catch fire. There is an image that's released online. I did not put it. I think I could have, but with copyright, I wasn't sure, so I just decided not to put it in here. This defect in the train industry is called a hot box. So I jump back and just kind of go back to this point in time. The train drove over a wayside defect detector, and the emergency brakes were engaged. A defect detector, which is on the next slide. It's a device that essentially just detects any defects on the train as the train is rolling over it. This is the defect detector. This will detect any objects that are hanging. And then this is actually this will point at the bearings, and if it will detect any radiation. So if a ball bearing is overheating, that device right there will send a signal to the train that, hey, there's a ball bearing that's overheating right now. That was covered on the last slide. I kind of already covered it. But at this point, there's no more reports as to what happened with the train. As far as the actual derailing of the train, this is as much information as we have. But with that being the case, that doesn't mean need to stop us from having a little fun and making our own theories, right? This is a real quick disclaimer. Please don't send me to prison for spreading misinformation. These are only our theories. I did not get this from any news site. I'm not claiming this is fact. This is just me messing around with numbers and seeing if I can get to the bottom as to what caused this. We'll start with a quote from Bob Hagan, and he said that it was a state representative, 50 years retiree from the railroad industry, say that the train was 2 to 3 times larger than it should have been. It said it was impossible for a conductor to look back on the curve and see a fire. So, I mean, when you look at this, this is almost 2 miles. This is almost 2 miles. There's no way a conductor can look behind him and see 2 miles back. So, yeah, I mean, clearly this was the train was too long. And then these were just some of the numbers that I looked up and was able to find out. So the train was 18,000 tons, which is over 16 million kilograms. The total train carried 151 cars. The 23rd rail car was the one that was overheated. The train, like I said, was 9,300 feet long. 50 trains derailed when this train had derailed at the time. And its speed was 47 miles per hour. So with those numbers, we can find things like the momentum, right? I had to look up how to give a good definition for momentum. The best way I can explain it is it's the power that is behind the object moving, or it's the force that can be potentially applied to an object if it were to run into it. And running the calculations, it is the mass times the speed, which came up to over 1 billion kilometer minutes. That is a lot. And then we also, I found the average of the car. Some of the cars were empty, others of them were really full. Using this information, we can actually find the tension of the 23rd car, which is the one that overheated. And I meant to put in a picture as to what this equation is, but this equation is its mass times the acceleration of gravity, and then this number right here is the contact point, how much contact is between the wheel and the rail. And then this is all divided by the square root of the radius of the of the wheel of the train minus that number again, the contact point squared. Using that, we can figure out how much kilonewtons was there, and it was over 1 million kilonewtons. Yeah. That's the tension between that car and the rest of the cars behind it. Yeah, this equation right here is the total number of cars minus the number car of the car with overheated bearing. And then I also figured out what the total tension at the head of the train was to the rest of the car, and that was 1,364,000 kilonewtons. So that's the max number of concrete numbers we could find. And these are also very loose. Remember that because remember some of the cars were empty, and I don't have the information as to which ones were full. Another note that is important is the train was in acceleration when it derailed. One important note is acceleration can be either positive or negative. So if it's slowing down, that's a form of acceleration. It's just negative acceleration. And the reason this is important is weird things can happen at acceleration points, right? So imagine you have a series of cars hooked together like this, right, with a hook. If I slow down, then there is suddenly give in here. It's no longer getting pulled correctly. Please don't try and steal my beautiful artwork. If you do, I do take cash, and I will take a check too if you really want this picture. I'm not sure what I'd sell it for yet. But if the wheel were to wear down, this is kind of going back to our theories, right? As to what was the cause, what could cause this train to actually derail. And one of my theories and one of our theories was if the wheel were to wear down, there would be less touching the ground at the time that the brakes were applied. That might cause the center car with the worn down wheel, the one with the ball bearing that had overheated, it would essentially be sandwiched in between the braking force of the train ahead of it and the momentum of the train behind it, which would cause this to essentially bubble out, right, while the rest of the train is going this way. This would actually be magnified if that train was empty, because then it would have no force of gravity. Well, it wouldn't have extra force of gravity acting on it. And then the other theory was if the ball bearing caused the shaft to be defective, then that would mean that the brakes on that train would not work at all. And it would only magnify the previous slide with my beautiful artwork. That would only magnify that and cause that to be even more so.
Now buckle up, guys, because I am going to be talking about. So the first one we were talking about the controlled burn. they did control turn of some of the cars that derailed in order to prevent explosions. And if I speak weirdly, I apologize in advance. Vinyl chloride. This is the first one. Is a big one. There was a 5 stars for this stuff, and it's used to create PVC, well, polyvinyl chloride, and a bunch of other polymers too. So 129 gallons of this stuff was used, and when you expose it to water, it does this cool thing where it evaporates immediately. Also carcinogen. Eyes, nose, lungs, creates all sorts of bad stuff happening. And when it's burned, it does another interesting thing where it releases a lot of chemicals. The kind of evaporation when sorry, I kept going my own tongue. I want to go back to the point of it evaporating with contact with water. Remember that, that's going to be important later. Now we're going to talk about some of the chemicals that are released when vinyl chloride is burned, including one of my favorite ones, phosphine. Speaking about phosphine, it's responsible for so it hasn't been proven yet. So there's no safe level. It's different chemicals do different things, but you take the student record 21. For a breast, to your sore throat, to the abdominal pain, ingest it like orally, to get a because there's no safe level of exposure for it because it's a known carcinogen again. Everybody, I want you to think about this picture. During when it contacts with water. You want to know what's in the atmosphere? Water. And when it evaporates, it creates a dense cloud. The train did that. Now, I do want to say that a lot of chemicals like that are really volatile. They do break down to different chemicals. It really isn't no impact afterwards. I worded that extremely awkwardly. There is still environmental impact, not just for the water, but also for the revenue. You can have the particles that create them for years and years. It can get into the soil. And a lot of people, a lot of sources are saying that it just happened because, corporate reasons. The train, as we said earlier, was sparked. let's get one. For impact. The animal ended up dying. But mandatory evacuation radius 2 miles. Allegedly, right now. Increase regulations, please. With the number of cars per trip. And full pneumatic brake. And it's modern brake. It's allegedly stops 50% quicker than the airbags that are mentioned in this brake. And I'll say this. The train that derailed in East Palestine is not carrying enough hazardous materials to legally be required to equip these ECC. Lobbying from the railway industry to regulations, which has happened a lot recently, a lot in the past couple of years, that's created a lot of problems. I apologize.
I'm not sure they did. I didn't, unfortunately.
All the seats downward at the gas. Groundwater spreads.
I think they released it. I think they did, yeah. I was wondering that too. I have no idea.
I never recall. Factor into that, drive it.
Another thing is, I don't know how many train companies are out there. But if there's like triple the amount and suppose one train company derails once every 3 years, that might not be worth it for them to put that money, for them, from a financial perspective, like you're saying. I don't think there is, yeah.
We line each other up, exactly.
then it actually forced it to dive down. Any questions for, I'm fans to ask any questions? You're like that 80 or not. Okay, that concludes our expo.